It was supposed to be a nothing moment, a quick pass in our too big Upper West Side apartment, just another random crossing in a space that felt cavernous with just a few of us rattling around. I didn't expect anything more than a polite nod in the hallway, a quick smile exchanged in the fading evening light that slanted through the living room windows. But from the moment Ethan moved back in, the air shifted, became thick, charged, almost buzzing. It wasn't like I planned for anything to happen, didn't even want it, but intentions and actions, they don't always line up, do they? I've been married to Richard for over 20 years, 20 solid, if not exactly thrilling years. Richard, with his endless work hours and perfectly tailored suits, was a creature of habit, a man of routine. Ethan, though, his energy filled the spaces Richard left empty, like water flooding cracks. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light, born out of loneliness maybe. But then came that afternoon in the storage room. Richard was out of town, of course, and Ethan and I were sorting through boxes, making small talk to fill the quiet. Then, a brush of his hand against mine, just fleeting, but it stopped me cold. His look lingered, a beat too long, a charged silence hanging between us, thick and heavy. I mumbled an excuse, heart hammering, pretending nothing had shifted, yet everything had. That was just the start. Now, here I am, staring at the echo of that moment, wondering how I ended up here, exiled from my own home, accused of things I can't quite deny. It was a normal Tuesday when I first really felt the space between Ethan and me shrinking, each silence stretching longer, each glance holding just a little too much. Richard, my husband of 22 years, was on one of his business trips again. Weeks went by where the only sounds in our apartment were the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the low creaks of the floorboards settling. Then Ethan had come back, bringing with him a silence that felt anything but empty. It wasn't like we talked much, actually the opposite. Ethan had this brooding, almost detached air about him, his presence both distant and strangely magnetic. He was Richard's son from his first marriage, 28 years old with a look that could stop you cold if he ever really focused it on you. Mostly, he kept his gaze down, his focus somewhere beyond everyone else's reach. That Tuesday, I was in the kitchen, doing dishes, when I sensed him there, just standing quietly in the doorway. I glanced over my shoulder, surprised to see him. His eyes were on me, expression unreadable darkening his face. "Ethan, do you need something?" I asked, breaking the silence. He shook his head and a slow, almost shy smile touched his lips. "Just came down for some water." His voice was soft, almost too quiet. "Didn't mean to disturb you." Disturb me? He had. Something about his tone, his stance, it left me feeling off balance, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I turned back to the sink, trying to shake off the feeling, but his presence lingered long after he was gone. It was like he'd carved a shape out of the air itself, one that pressed against my thoughts with a persistent, uncomfortable familiarity. Over the next few days, we seemed to cross paths more than seemed possible in an apartment this size. He was always just there. In the hallway as I came back from errands, on the small balcony as I watered the potted plants, even in the laundry room one afternoon as I was folding Richard's shirts. Each encounter felt like a deliberate accident, an invisible line being tested, drawn a little closer every time we exchanged a look, a word. I found myself studying Ethan in a way I hadn't before, noticing details I'd never paid attention to. His quiet intensity, the way his fingers moved when he typed on his laptop, the slight lift of his eyebrow when he was deep in thought. It was all wrong, of course. I was his father's wife. But once a thought like that starts taking root, it becomes almost impossible to pull out. One evening, I passed the hall mirror and barely recognized myself. A woman with graying hair, softly curling at her temples, looked back at me, her expression a mix of curiosity and worry. I'd never thought of myself as someone prone to flirtation, to intrigue, but the distance between Richard and me had stretched into a chasm over the years, a chasm that seemed to widen with every trip he took, every late dinner he missed. And there was Ethan, bridging that gap, however subtly, however unintentionally. The weight of that realization hit me harder than I wanted to admit. The following week, Richard announced he'd be out of town again, this time for 4 days. Part of me felt relief. Another part, the part I was ashamed to acknowledge, felt something else, an anticipation I didn't fully understand. The first day he was gone, I found myself alone in the storage room, trying to make sense of the chaos of boxes we'd accumulated over the years. I just reached for a particularly heavy one when I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Ethan standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. You shouldn't be lifting things like that, he said, stepping closer. I laughed it off, brushing a stray strand of hair from my forehead. I can manage. These boxes don't scare me. He took the box from me anyway, setting it down with ease. His arm brushed against mine as he moved, and the touch, however brief, sent a jolt through me. I could feel my cheeks warming, and I quickly turned away, hoping he wouldn't notice, but he was watching me, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. You know, you don't have to do this alone, he said quietly. I can help. There was a pause, a thick, charged silence that settled around us like a blanket. I should have left, should have broken whatever unspoken connection was simmering between us, but I didn't. Instead, I nodded, my heart pounding as we worked side by side, wordlessly, each movement punctuated by the occasional brush of his hand, a glance that lingered a moment too long. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something I hadn't anticipated or wanted. But once you feel that spark, it's hard to pretend it isn't there. 2 days later, Richard was still away, and I had the apartment to myself, or so I thought. I'd just finished a long, hot shower, letting the steam cloud my thoughts as I tried to wash away the creeping guilt. Lost in my own head, I left the bathroom door slightly ajar, thinking I was alone. When I turned around, wrapping a towel around myself, I saw Ethan standing in the hallway, his gaze fixed squarely on me. My heart stopped for a beat, and an unfamiliar thrill shot through me, mingled with a sharp spike of panic. I'm sorry, I stammered, pulling the towel tighter around myself. I thought I was alone. He didn't move, didn't look away. His eyes were dark, unreadable. It's your apartment, he said, a hint of something in his tone that sent a shiver down my spine. You don't need to apologize. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension hung heavy in the air, palpable and unyielding, as though we were both waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, breathless and unnerved. The next day, Richard came home early. He seemed distant, preoccupied, his usual briskness tempered by something I couldn't quite place. I tried to ask about his trip, but he barely responded, muttering something about work stress before disappearing into his study. Later that evening, he found me in the kitchen, his expression unreadable as he took a deep breath. We need to talk. A chill ran down my spine. I put down the glass I was holding and looked at him, feeling a dread I couldn't quite explain. What's wrong? He hesitated, then crossed his arms, his gaze cold. Ethan told me something, he said. He said you made advances on him. The words hit me like a slap. I staggered back, stunned. Richard, that's not true. I would never... But he cut me off, his face contorted in anger. I trusted you, Sarah. I believed you were better than this. His voice was low, filled with a bitterness that shook me to my core. I tried to explain, to find the words to defend myself, but they wouldn't come. The memory of those fleeting moments with Ethan, the touches and glances that had felt innocent at the time, now twisted into something far more sinister. Had I crossed a line without realizing it? Had I let something grow that should have been snuffed out from the start? Richard didn't wait for an explanation. He told me to leave, to get out of the apartment and not come back. And as I stood there staring at the man I'd built a life with, I realized I had no defense. Because deep down, I wasn't even sure he was wrong. Standing on the sidewalk, suitcase in hand, I felt the sting of rejection settle into my bones. Richard's words echoed in my mind, each accusation sharpening the reality of what had just happened. I hadn't even been allowed to pack properly. Just a few essentials thrown into a bag, the rest abandoned. I glanced back at the building, half expecting Richard to come after me, to stop me, to listen. But he didn't. I had nowhere to go, nowhere that felt like mine. Our marriage had been my anchor and the apartment my refuge. Without either, I felt untethered, adrift. I got into a cab, staring blankly at the traffic ahead, fighting back the panic rising in my chest. I'd never been a woman who walked out without a plan, but that day, I didn't have the strength to think, let alone plan. After driving aimlessly for hours, I ended up in the parking lot of a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. The neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering between VAC and ANC, but I barely noticed. I was exhausted, drained of any energy to keep my thoughts in check. Checking in felt surreal, a step down from the life I'd known. As I lay on the scratchy motel sheets, staring at the peeling wallpaper, the disbelief finally sank into anger. The next morning, my mind was clearer, sharper. I couldn't accept that my entire life had unraveled because of a few accusations from Ethan. I replayed each encounter, dissecting every touch, every look. Had I really encouraged him? Did I somehow give him reason to think I'd been interested? But that uncertainty only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to be humiliated without understanding why he'd done this. I knew Richard wouldn't believe me. He'd made that painfully clear. But that didn't mean I couldn't figure out the truth for myself. I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to start where it all began, with Ethan's past. Ethan had returned home only a few months prior, a quiet man with a mysterious air. I'd heard Richard mention his struggles after a failed business out west, but Richard's explanations were always vague, protective even. Ethan had drifted in and out of our lives before, but I'd assumed this time he was back for good. That afternoon, I drove back into the city to visit the one person who might have answers. Brenda, an old friend of Richard's who worked at a real estate agency and had connections all over town. Brenda was the kind of woman who knew things about everyone, whether they wanted her to or not. I hadn't seen her in years, but I knew if anyone could give me insight into Ethan's world, it was her. "Sarah, what a surprise!" Brenda exclaimed, waving me over to her office. Her gaze was sharp as she took in my worn expression, but she didn't pry. Instead, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and gave me that knowing look she reserved for moments when secrets were about to be spilled. "Brenda, I need to know about Ethan," I said, skipping the pleasantries. Her eyebrow arched, and for a moment she looked almost amused. "Richard's son. Quite the enigma, isn't he? Word is, he's had a bit of trouble lately." She paused, glancing at me carefully. "But why do you want to know?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "There's been tension between us. He's caused some trouble for Richard and me, and I need to know what he's capable of." Brenda's gaze softened slightly. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Ethan isn't what he seems, Sarah. He's charming, sure, but he's been in debt for years. Took out loans for that tech startup that flopped, and he hasn't recovered since. He keeps pulling people in, making promises he can't keep. I'd be careful around him." I swallowed, the pieces beginning to align in my mind. Was he manipulative? "More than manipulative," Brenda said, her tone darkening. "He's ruined lives, Sarah. A friend of mine got wrapped up in his promises, financially and personally. She lost a lot before she wised up. He's dangerous." The conversation left me shaken. Ethan had seemed lost and vulnerable, a man who just needed guidance. But now, I was seeing a different side of him, one carefully hidden beneath the veneer of charm. Had he come back to Richard simply to gain access to our resources? After leaving Brenda's office, I sat in my car, processing what I'd learned. I could see how Ethan had played on Richard's sympathy, spinning tales of hardship, subtly positioning himself as the victim of circumstances. Richard had always had a blind spot for his son, a weakness Ethan must have known how to exploit. The more I thought about it, the queerer Ethan's motivations became, and yet another darker possibility loomed in the back of my mind. Had he deliberately pushed me out to secure his position, to drive a wedge between Richard and me? The truth felt relentless, and I felt an anger building inside. I had been naive, lulled by his facade. The quiet smiles, the shared glances, they hadn't been innocent. They'd been calculated, each one a step toward this moment. And now, here I was, exiled from my own home, left to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized, determined to get to the bottom of things. I decided to look into Ethan's failed business out west. A quick search on my phone led me to an address for his old business partner, a man named Greg Nolan. He was an entrepreneur known for his high-stakes investments and even higher-stakes mistakes. If anyone knew the truth behind Ethan's past, it would be Greg. The next day, I booked a flight out west. It felt strange seeking out answers this way, almost as though I were preparing for a confrontation. When I arrived at Greg's office, a young receptionist gave me a curious look before disappearing into a back room. Moments later, a tall man in a crisp suit emerged, his expression guarded. "You're here about Ethan, aren't you?" he asked, his voice clipped. I nodded, not bothering to explain further. Greg gestured toward a chair. "Take a seat, Mrs. Ward." His tone was polite but distant, as though I were just another business associate. Ethan was talented, I'll give him that. But he was reckless. He burned through every bit of capital we had and then some. I had no choice but to pull out before he dragged us both under. "Did he ever—" I hesitated, feeling a surge of embarrassment at the question. "Did he ever manipulate you? I mean, did he lie about things?" A faint smile tugged at Greg's lips, but it wasn't a pleasant one. "That's his specialty. He's a master at twisting the truth, saying exactly what you need to hear to keep you hooked. He did it with me, and he's done it with plenty of others. You're not the first person to be blindsided by Ethan's charm." The conversation confirmed what I'd feared. Ethan hadn't just been unlucky. He was a calculated manipulator, one who knew how to use people to his advantage. I left Greg's office with a sense of grim determination. Whatever spell Ethan had cast over Richard, I was going to break it. He had shattered my life, and I wasn't going to let him ruin Richard's as well. 2 days later, I returned to the city, parking outside the building that had once been mine. Part of me wanted to march in and confront Richard, to force him to see the truth. But another part of me hesitated, the weight of my accusations feeling heavier than ever. Instead, I decided to try a different approach. If Richard wouldn't hear the truth from me, perhaps he'd believe it from someone else. I called Brenda again, asking if she'd be willing to talk to Richard. She agreed, her tone sympathetic. "Sarah, you've been through enough," she said. "He deserves to know what kind of person his son really is." That evening, I waited across the street, watching as Brenda's car pulled into our driveway. She stayed for nearly an hour, and when she finally left, I watched as Richard stood in the doorway, his posture tense, his expression unreadable. As the door closed, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The truth was finally out there. Now, all I could do was wait and see what Richard would do with it. When I returned to the motel that night, I found myself unable to sleep. Images of Ethan, his manipulative smile, and haunting glances played through my mind. I tried to imagine how Richard was feeling if he'd finally opened his eyes to the truth after Brenda's visit. I kept replaying our last moments together, Richard's coldness, his unwillingness to listen, and I couldn't shake the bitterness that had settled in my chest. The next morning, I decided I couldn't just sit back and wait for him to reach out. If Richard truly knew what Ethan was capable of, he would come looking for me. So I called, each ring a beat of desperation and dread until his voice, curt and formal, finally answered. "Richard, it's me," I started, heart racing. He was silent for a moment, the line heavy with tension. "What do you want, Sarah?" My voice faltered. I hadn't expected his tone to be so harsh, as if I were a stranger. Did you talk to Brenda?" A sigh escaped him. "I did. She had some interesting things to say." A flicker of hope ignited in me. "So, you believe me?" "I didn't say that," he cut in, his voice laced with skepticism. "What I believe, Sarah, is that there's a lot more going on here than you're telling me." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "Richard, I've told you the truth. Ethan manipulated you, manipulated us. He's lying. He's always been lying." Richard's silence stretched out, cold and impenetrable. "I'll talk to Ethan myself," he said finally, his voice dismissive. "I don't need any more stories." And with that, he hung up, leaving me alone in the deafening silence. My hands trembled as I sat down the phone. The door I thought I'd opened had just slammed shut. With nowhere else to go, I threw myself into finding out every detail of Ethan's life I could unearth. I wanted something concrete, irrefutable that Richard couldn't dismiss. The bitterness in Richard's voice had only deepened my resolve. It was clear that Ethan had poisoned him against me completely, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. Later that day, I drove to a dive bar I discovered from one of Ethan's old social media posts. It was a rough place, tucked into an alley near downtown, a spot where he'd spent time with old business partners and shady acquaintances. I figured if Ethan had anything to hide, someone here might know. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, seemed reluctant to speak at first, but after I slipped him some cash and shared a few words, he began to open up. "You're asking about Ethan?" Pete said, eyeing me skeptically. "He used to be in here a lot. Yeah, real smooth talker, that one." "Did he ever mention anything unusual?" I pressed, leaning in. "Anyone he might have crossed?" Pete shrugged, wiping down the counter. "Only heard bits and pieces, something about a debt he couldn't shake. Got into some trouble with the wrong folks. Last time I saw him, he was acting real nervous, kept looking over his shoulder like someone was after him." A chill ran down my spine. Ethan hadn't just been manipulating people. He'd been living a life of secrets, lies, and debts he couldn't repay. And now, he'd brought that darkness into our lives. As I left the bar, my mind whirled with questions. What exactly had Ethan dragged us into? And if he was desperate enough to lie about me, what else was he willing to do? That evening, unable to keep away, I drove back to the apartment building. I parked a few blocks down, watching as dusk settled over the neighborhood. After nearly an hour, I saw Richard's car pull into the garage, followed by Ethan emerging from the lobby. They stood in the entryway, talking in hushed tones, their body language tense. I rolled down my window slightly, straining to hear. I could make out fragments of their conversation, words that cut through the night air like glass. You don't understand, Dad, Ethan was saying, his voice low but insistent. I need your support right now. She's trying to ruin us. Richard rubbed his temples, looking weary. This situation is a mess, Ethan. Brenda told me things I don't want to believe. Ethan's face darkened, a glint of anger flashing in his eyes. She's lying, just like Sarah. They're both trying to turn you against me. You can't let them do this. As Richard's shoulders sagged, I felt a swell of anger. Ethan had him right where he wanted him, wrapped up in guilt, doubt, and fear. I wanted to burst out of the cab, confront them both, make Richard see what was right in front of him. But I held back. Charging into the situation wouldn't make Richard believe me. I needed more, something undeniable. Over the next few days, an idea took shape in my mind. I remembered Richard's old tape recorder, tucked away in his study. It was part of a recording system he'd used for city council meetings, a device he rarely touched anymore. If I could record Ethan confessing something, anything, it might be enough to break his hold on Richard. Late one night, I snuck back to the apartment building, my heart pounding as I crept through the lobby and slipped into the elevator. The apartment was dark, quiet, the air thick with a tense stillness. Moving quickly, I found the recorder in Richard's study and turned it on, tucking it out of sight on the edge of the desk. I knew it was a gamble, but I was willing to risk anything to expose the truth. Then I waited, hidden in the shadows, as the apartment remained silent. It felt like hours before I finally heard voices, Richard and Ethan murmuring in low tones as they entered the study. I pressed myself into a corner, barely daring to breathe. The conversation started innocently enough. Richard asking Ethan about finances, about his future plans. But as the discussion deepened, Ethan's tone grew sharper, defensive. You think I'm a failure, don't you? Ethan snapped, his voice laced with bitterness. No, Ethan, Richard said, his tone weary. I'm just concerned. Sarah has a point. You need to be more careful with your choices. There was a pause, a tension hanging heavy in the room. Then Ethan laughed, a low, mirthless sound. Sarah's only saying that because she wants to see me gone. She'd do anything to get rid of me. My pulse quickened. This was it, the crack in his facade. Listen to yourself, Dad, Ethan continued, his voice lowering. You trust her more than you trust me. But if you only knew what she's done. The conversation trailed off, their voices fading as they moved into another room. But the damage had been done. Ethan had shown his true colors, even if only briefly. As soon as the apartment was empty the next morning, I slipped back in, retrieved the recorder, and played it back, my hands shaking as I listened. Ethan's bitterness, his manipulation, they were all there, captured on tape. I could barely contain the satisfaction rising in my chest. This was my proof, the evidence Richard would have to believe. I went back to the motel, my mind racing with what I would say. I imagined Richard's face when he heard the recording, the realization that would finally shatter Ethan's hold over him. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that things might finally change. That evening, I called Richard, my voice steady as I asked him to meet me in person. There was a pause, then a reluctant sigh. Fine. Tomorrow afternoon. My office. When I hung up, I felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. The next day, I arrived at Richard's office, the tape recorder in hand, my pulse racing. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would convey calm and control, hoping it would lend strength to my words. Richard looked tired when he met me, his expression guarded. He didn't offer a smile, merely gestured to the chair opposite his desk. This had better be worth my time, Sarah. I met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. Richard, I know things between us have been difficult, but you need to hear this. You need to know the truth about Ethan. He sighed, rubbing his temples, but gestured for me to continue. I took a deep breath, then played the recording, watching his face as Ethan's words filled the room. The bitterness, the manipulation, it was all there, laid bare. As the tape ended, Richard's expression shifted, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, he looked like a man finally seeing the world clearly after being lost in the dark. I didn't know, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought, Ethan's been playing you, Richard, I said softly. He's lied to both of us, and he's been lying for a long time. He looked away, shame and anger flickering across his face. Finally, he nodded, his expression resolute. You're right, Sarah. It's time I confronted him. The following evening, Richard summoned Ethan to his study. I wasn't there, but Richard later recounted it to me in painful detail, the memory still fresh and raw in his mind. Richard had replayed the recording alone that afternoon, his face set in a mask of grim determination. As Ethan entered the study, Richard watched him closely, taking in the guarded look in his son's eyes, the defensive posture. "Sit down, Ethan," Richard said, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. He gestured toward the chair across from him, and after a brief hesitation, Ethan obeyed, eyeing his father wearily. "What's this about, Dad?" Ethan asked, his tone of forced calm. Richard took a deep breath, gathering himself. "I want you to listen to something," he said, pressing play on the tape recorder. As Ethan's own words echoed back at him, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to anger. When the tape ended, he stared at his father, fury blazing in his eyes. "You're going to believe her over me? Your own son?" Richard's voice was steady, though his hand trembled slightly. "I'm not choosing sides, Ethan. I'm looking at the facts. And the facts are that you've been lying to me, manipulating me." "Manipulating you?" Ethan scoffed, standing abruptly, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you know everything, don't you? You think you can just judge me without understanding anything?" Richard narrowed his eyes, his own anger simmering. "Then tell me, Ethan. Explain it to me." For a moment, Ethan seemed at a loss for words. Then, his face twisted into a bitter smile. "Fine. You want the truth? Sarah was never innocent, Dad. She wanted this. Wanted the attention, the thrill. She encouraged it." The words struck Richard like a physical blow, his face paling as he struggled to process Ethan's claim. That's not possible." "Oh, it's possible, all right," Ethan sneered. "But you're too blind to see it. You've always been too focused on your own life to notice what's happening right under your nose." Richard felt his composure slipping, rage bubbling beneath the surface. "Enough, Ethan," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've done enough damage." But Ethan wasn't finished. His voice dropped to a dangerous low, a look of pure defiance in his eyes. "You want me out of the apartment? Fine. But don't think this is over. You owe me, Dad, and I'll make sure you remember that." Without another word, Ethan stormed out of the study, slamming the door behind him, leaving Richard alone with a silence heavy with betrayal and regret. The confrontation left Richard shaken. For days afterward, he withdrew into himself, barely speaking, his mind consumed by the realization of what had happened. The betrayal cut deep, a wound that he could neither fully comprehend nor heal. One evening, Richard called me, his voice subdued, his words hesitant. "Sarah, I think I owe you an apology." I listened, my heart aching with a mix of anger and pity. "You didn't believe me, Richard," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "You let him turn you against me." He sighed, a sound filled with exhaustion and regret. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it." For a moment, I considered forgiving him, but the hurt ran too deep, the scars too fresh. "I don't know if that's enough," I said softly, "but it's a start." There was a silence, then he spoke again, his voice rough. "Ethan is gone, left without a word. But I don't think he's done, Sarah. I feel like he's still holding something over me." The unease in his voice sent a chill down my spine. Ethan was gone, but his shadow lingered, a reminder of the chaos he'd sown. Weeks passed, and I tried to rebuild my life, distancing myself from the wreckage that Ethan had left behind. But just as I began to feel a semblance of peace, a message arrived. It was from Ethan. The message was cryptic, a vague threat wrapped in polite words. "I hope you're well, Sarah," it read. "I thought we might catch up sometime. After all, we have unfinished business." A knot of dread twisted in my stomach. I hadn't heard from him since he'd left, and now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out. It didn't feel like a coincidence. Later that evening, I shared the message with Richard. He looked pale, his face lined with worry. "What does he want from us?" he muttered, half to himself. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "But whatever it is, I don't think it's anything good." The days that followed were filled with an uneasy anticipation, a feeling that something terrible was lurking just beyond sight. I began to feel as though I were being watched, catching glimpses of figures in the corner of my vision, only to find nothing there. One evening, as I returned to my motel room, I found the door ajar. My heart raced as I stepped inside, half expecting to find Ethan waiting for me. But the room was empty, everything as I'd left it, except for one thing. On the bed lay an old photograph of Richard, Ethan, and me taken years ago. It was worn, creased down the middle, Ethan's face scratched out. A chill ran down my spine as I held the photo, my hands shaking. This was more than a threat. It was a message, a warning that Ethan wasn't finished with us. He wanted us to suffer, to feel the weight of his presence even in his absence. I called Richard, my voice shaking as I recounted what I'd found. He listened in silence, his own fear evident in his voice. When he finally spoke, "Sarah, I think we're in more danger than we realized." We knew we couldn't live under Ethan's shadow forever. So Richard and I began to formulate a plan. We contacted a lawyer, someone who could help us ensure that Ethan couldn't use any of his manipulations against us legally. We'd also reach out to a private investigator to keep tabs on Ethan, hoping to gather enough evidence to cut him off completely. But just as we were about to put our plan into motion, Ethan resurfaced. It was a cold afternoon when he appeared at Richard's office. Richard had been expecting a business associate, so he was completely unprepared when Ethan walked in, a dark grin on his face. "Surprised to see me, Dad?" Ethan said, his tone mocking. "You thought you could just push me out and I'd disappear?" Richard stood, his fists clenched, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "You have no business here, Ethan. Leave." Ethan laughed, a cold, hollow sound that filled the room. "Oh, I'm not here to stay, Dad. Just wanted to remind you of all the things I know about you, about your little secrets. It'd be a shame if they came to light." Richard's resolve faltered, fear flickering in his eyes. "What do you want?" "Simple," Ethan replied, his voice laced with malice. "Everything you owe me, and trust me, I'll make sure I get it." After Ethan left, Richard called me, his voice trembling. "He's not backing down, Sarah. He wants everything. Money, control, even our reputation. He's willing to destroy us if he has to." I could hear the fear in his voice, a fear that mirrored my own. Ethan had pushed us to the edge, leaving us with no choice but to fight back. But how could we fight someone who knew every weakness, every secret we'd ever tried to bury? In a moment of desperation, I suggested the unthinkable. "Richard, what if we went public? Exposed everything ourselves before Ethan has a chance to twist it?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I knew the idea was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way we could reclaim any semblance of control. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice steady. "You're right. We've been playing by his rules long enough. It's time to turn the tables." Together, Richard and I crafted a statement, revealing the truth about our relationship with Ethan, his manipulations, and the toll he'd taken on our lives. It was a move born out of desperation, a final attempt to free ourselves from his hold. When we went public, the reaction was immediate. Friends, family, even the media reached out, shocked and curious. And though it was painful to expose our lives so openly, the response brought a sense of liberation, as though a weight had been lifted. But we knew it wouldn't be enough to stop Ethan. We needed more than words, more than sympathy. We needed a definitive end. Going public had been like lifting a veil. We felt a temporary reprieve, a brief sense of freedom. With our story out in the open, people began to see Ethan for who he truly was. Close friends offered support, and the community expressed shock and sympathy. Richard and I finally felt the weight of secrecy lifting, and for the first time, there was a glimmer of peace. But the calm didn't last long. As the days went by, I began to sense an undercurrent of danger lurking beneath the surface, as if Ethan was lying in wait, biding his time. Then one afternoon, I found a note slipped under the door of my motel room. The handwriting was unmistakably Ethan's, a jagged scrawl that sent a chill down my spine. "Fine. Did you think you could escape that easily?" The note read. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts." A surge of fear gripped me, mixed with a creeping realization. Ethan wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything. This wasn't just about money or power anymore. It was about revenge. His twisted need to make us suffer was far from over. That evening, Richard and I met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, hoping to devise a plan that would put an end to Ethan's threats once and for all. Richard was visibly shaken by the note, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred his coffee. "We can't live like this, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There has to be a way to make him stop." I nodded, feeling the same desperation. "He's already shown us he's willing to go to any lengths. The only way to protect ourselves is to have something over him, something so damning that he wouldn't dare retaliate." Richard considered this, his brow furrowed. "Ethan has always been careful, but there might be something. He had a series of failed investments, risky deals. If we could find proof of something illegal, we might be able to use it against him." I wasn't sure where to start, but the idea gave me a renewed sense of hope. If Ethan had indeed crossed legal lines in his past, there could be records, even witnesses, who would be willing to speak out. The next day, I made a call to the private investigator we'd consulted earlier, a sharp-witted man named Harris, who had a knack for uncovering hidden truths. I explained our new plan, urging him to focus on Ethan's past business dealings, particularly anything that might point to fraud or misconduct. "I'll see what I can dig up," Harris replied, his tone cautious. "But it might take a few days. He's a slippery one, that Ethan." While Harris worked on tracking down evidence, Richard and I resumed our normal lives as best we could, waiting anxiously for news. Days passed without incident, and though the threat of Ethan loomed in the back of our minds, the sense of dread began to dull, replaced by a fragile optimism that maybe, just maybe, we'd finally have the upper hand. Then, 3 days later, Harris called. "I found something," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Ethan was involved in a fraudulent investment scheme. His partners were implicated, but Ethan managed to slip through the cracks. Until now. I have records, statements, even a few witnesses willing to come forward. Relief flooded through me. With this information, we could finally confront Ethan on our own terms. Richard and I arranged a meeting with Ethan, choosing a neutral location, a small private office space downtown, away from prying eyes. The plan was simple. Confront him with the evidence, give him a choice, to leave us alone or face the legal consequences of his actions. When Ethan arrived, his demeanor was calm, almost casual, as though he had no fear of the position we'd put him in. He glanced between Richard and me, a smug smile playing on his lips. "So what's this about?" he asked, his tone dripping with mocked curiosity. Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We know about the fraudulent investments, Ethan. We have evidence enough to put you in prison if we wanted to." Ethan's face faltered for a split second, a flicker of panic crossing his eyes before he masked it with a cold, calculating look. "You're bluffing," he sneered. "You wouldn't dare." I held up the folder Harris had given us, filled with incriminating documents. "This isn't a bluff, Ethan. We have everything we need to take this to the authorities, but we're giving you a choice. Leave us alone, walk away, and this stays between us." For a moment, Ethan was silent, his eyes darting between the folder and our faces. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing his options, calculating the risks. Finally, he laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "You win. I'll leave you to your pathetic lives. But remember this, you'll never be free of me. Not really." With that, he stormed out, leaving behind a silence thick with tension and unease. After Ethan's departure, Richard and I sat in silence, each of us processing the events that had unfolded. The victory felt hollow, tainted by Ethan's parting words, a reminder that his shadow would always linger over us. Over the following weeks, life slowly returned to a semblance of normality. The threat of Ethan had been neutralized, at least on the surface. But there were scars, invisible yet deep, a constant reminder of the chaos he'd brought into our lives. One evening, as Richard and I shared a quiet dinner, he reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "I know it's been difficult," he said softly, "but I'm grateful you stayed with me through this." I smiled faintly, the warmth of his hand a comfort. "We've been through worse," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure if it was true. What Ethan had done had left an indelible mark on us, one that time alone couldn't erase. Just as we began to believe that Ethan had finally disappeared from our lives, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me, and as I opened it, my hands began to tremble. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakable. "Did you really think you could get rid of me so easily?" it read. "This isn't over." The words sent a chill down my spine, a sick realization that our nightmare was far from over. Ethan had no intention of letting us go. He was still out there, still watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. I shared the letter with Richard, his face growing pale as he read the words. "He's taunting us," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. "He's trying to scare us." But it was more than that. Ethan was reminding us that despite everything we'd done, he still held power over us, an invisible force lurking just beyond reach. With Ethan's threat hanging over us, Richard and I faced a difficult choice. We could continue to live in fear, constantly looking over our shoulders, or we could take the ultimate step to protect ourselves. The decision weighed heavily on both of us, the thought of cutting ties so completely, so irrevocably. After days of agonizing over our options, we reached a decision. We would leave. Sell the apartment, sever all ties, and start fresh somewhere far away. It was drastic, but it was the only way to truly escape Ethan's reach. Within weeks, we'd sold the apartment, packed up our belongings, and prepared to leave town. It felt surreal, leaving behind everything we'd built. The the life we'd known for so long. But the relief that came with it was undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, a glimmer of hope for a future free of fear. As we drove out of the city, Richard reached over, taking my hand in his. "We'll be all right," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We have each other, and that's all we need." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. We'd lost so much, endured so many trials, but we were still standing, still together. As the miles stretched before us, the memories of Ethan began to fade, replaced by the promise of a new beginning, a life untouched by his darkness.